The whip cracked through the dry air, louder than the buzzing of locusts and the creaking of wagon wheels, and Ella flinched as if the sound itself had sliced into her skin. The town square reeked of sweat, horse dung, and cheap whiskey, the summer heat pressing down on every living soul like a punishment from the heavens. Dust swirled up with every boot step, clinging to Ella's damp skin, mixing with the salt of her tears. Her wrists, bound with coarse hemp rope, throbbed where the fibers had bitten raw into her flesh. She was 30 years old, but years of hunger, grief, and cruelty had carved lines into her face far deeper than her age deserved. Around her, men gathered like vultures circling a carcass, their spurs jangling, their tobacco-stained teeth bared. In smirks, a few women stood in the shadows, whispering behind gloved hands, pretending disapproval but unable to look away. To them, Ella was not a woman at all, just another piece of property, a body to be bartered, her worth measured in coins and labor. Her stepmother, Mrs. Aldridge, stood tall on the wooden porch of the trading post, parasol shading her pale face from the blazing sun. Her lips curled into a smile that had no warmth, only profit. $30 for the girl, she shouted to the crowd, her voice sharp as a hawk's cry. Strong, obedient, and healthy. She cook, she clean, she serve. You won't find better stock this side of Abilene. Laughter rippled through the gathering, followed by a few half-hearted bids. $10, $15. She ain't worth 20, not at her age. Each word drove deeper into Ella's chest, hollowing her out. Once, she had dreamed of tending her father's ranch, riding through fields of wildflowers with the wind in her hair. But her father had died suddenly, leaving the land in the hands of a widow who had wasted no time turning inheritance into her own gain. The ranch was sold, the cattle driven off, and Ella, his only daughter, reduced to this, a slave, stripped of dignity before the eyes of strangers. Her throat ached with thirst, but she forced herself to swallow the lump of rage and humiliation that rose there. She would not cry, not for them. Not for the stepmother who had locked her in the cellar when she refused to obey, who had laughed at her hunger and sneered at her dreams. No, Ella would not give her that satisfaction. The bidding slowed the crowd restless. Some men spat on the ground, muttering about better deals to be found at the cattle yards. Mrs. Aldridge's eyes flashed with impatience. She cracked the whip again, making Ella flinch, and snapped, "She's strong. Look at her arms. She can lift, she can work. $30, gentleman cheap as dirt for a worker who won't run." But before the jeers could swell again, silence cut through the crowd. It was sudden, sharp, like the hush that falls before a storm. Every head turned as a figure stepped from the edge of the square. He was taller than most, shoulders broad, his bare arms marked with inked patterns that spiraled down like rivers of memory and battle. His skin was bronze from the sun, his long black hair loose, moving with the breeze as if alive. A warrior, a Comanche. His very presence sent unease rippling through the men, some gripping their pistols, others muttering under their breath. He didn't speak at first, only walked with a deliberate calm to the porch where Ella's stepmother waited. Dust clung to his boots, silver earrings glinted at his ears, and every eye followed the slow, steady rhythm of his stride. He stopped before Mrs. Aldridge, his gaze burning, unreadable. Without a word, he reached into a worn leather pouch at his side. His hand emerged not with coins, but with rough silver nuggets, raw and gleaming under the merciless sun. He let them fall at her feet, the sound like thunder against the wooden boards. "This buys her," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying across the square with the weight of a man who did not bargain. Gasps broke through the crowd. A woman clutched her child's arm. A rancher cursed under his breath. Mrs. Aldridge blinked, then bent quickly, scooping up the silver as greed shone in her eyes. "Done," she said, her voice trembling with triumph. "She's yours." Ella's breath caught in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt the iron bars of her fate shift, not break, but shift. She stared at the warrior, her heart thundering louder than the horses tied nearby. Had he saved her? Or had he only purchased another kind of cage? The sun blared down on the answer she could not yet see. That night, Ella rode behind him across the open plains, her wrists free, but her heart chained by fear and uncertainty. The warrior hadn't said more than a handful of words since the exchange in town. He had lifted her onto his horse without hesitation, his hand firm, his eyes unreadable, and they had ridden away from the square under the judgmental stares of dozens. The world beyond town stretched wide, and merciless rolling desert hills baked hard under the last red of sunset. The air sharp with dust and sagebrush. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, their cries rising and falling like mournful songs. Ella clung to the back of the saddle, her hands uncertainly resting against the man's waist. His body was solid, carved of muscle and tension, every movement of the horse flowing into him as though beast and rider were one. The farther they rode, the more the lights of town vanished, swallowed by night. Ella turned her head once, just to look back. It startled her, how quickly everything she had known was already nothing but a cluster of lamps swallowed by darkness. Her stepmother's greedy eyes, the men's jeering faces, the shame of being displayed like cattle, all of it slipped into shadow. Yet that shadow clung inside her, refusing to fade. Her voice cracked when she finally asked, "Why did you buy me?" At first, she thought he hadn't heard. The wind rushed against her ears, carrying the bitter taste of sand. His silence stretched, so long that she wished she hadn't spoken. But then, without turning his head, he answered, "No woman should be sold like cattle." His tone was low, steady, as if he were speaking a truth that had lived inside him long before she had asked. No hesitation, no embellishment, just that simple fact. Ella gripped the saddle tighter. His words should have comforted her, but instead they unsettled her. Did he mean he would set her free? Or had he simply exchanged her bondage for one of his own making? She had been bought before the eyes of men who saw women as property. Was she now his property too, no matter what his words claimed? The horse slowed as the moon climbed higher, a pale lantern in the endless sky. The desert cooled quickly. The heat of day was replaced by a chill that bit at Ella's skin. She shivered, wishing for a shawl, wishing for a fire, wishing for answers. Warrior noticed. Without a word, he reached back, pulling a fur-lined blanket from the saddle roll and tossed it over her shoulders. His hand brushed her arm only briefly, but in that fleeting contact, Ella felt a warmth that startled her. He did not linger, did not meet her gaze, just returned his hand to the reins and urged the horse forward again. Her throat tightened. She could not remember the last time someone had covered her with kindness instead of cruelty. Hours passed in silence. The rhythm of hooves against the hard earth became a heartbeat, steady and unbroken. The smell of leather and horse sweat mixed with the faint scent of cedar that clung to the warrior's skin. Ella found herself leaning slightly against his back, not out of choice but because exhaustion weighed on her bones. Each time her eyes drifted shut, she saw her stepmother smirk, heard the crowd's laughter, felt the sting of rope on her wrists. She would jolt awake, clutching the blanket closer, reminding herself that she was no longer standing on that wooden porch. Yet freedom felt fragile, uncertain. When the horizon began to pale, touched by the gray of dawn, Ella's chest ached with unspoken questions. What life awaited her now? Would she be left alone in some wilderness camp, or folded into the lives of strangers who looked at her with suspicion? She had no coin, no land, no name worth respect, and yet she glanced at the man riding before her, his long hair catching the light of morning, his posture straight and sure as if he carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders. He had paid for her freedom with silver, shocking the town into silence, defying the stepmother's cruelty, facing down the glares of armed men without flinching. Something dangerous stirred in her chest. Not gratitude exactly, not yet trust. Something else. Something like hope. She pressed her palm to her chest as though she could hold that fragile ember in place, terrified it might burn away at the first gust of wind. The sun broke the horizon, then spilling fire across the plains. They rode into it together, shadows stretching long behind them, Ella's heart torn between fear of what she had lost and trembling wonder at what she might be about to find. At dawn, they reached a wide valley where the land dipped toward a river curling silver beneath the rising sun. Mist hovered above the water, lifting slowly like smoke from a dying fire. Ella blinked against the brightness, her eyes stinging. From a night without sleep, her body aching from hours in the saddle, she had never ridden so far in a single stretch. Yet the warrior Kael, she would later learn his name, sat tall and tireless, his back unbending, his gaze locked on the land ahead as though he belonged to it in ways she could never understand. As they crested a low ridge, Ella saw it. A circle of lodges spread across the valley floor, smoke rising lazily from several fires. Children darted barefoot through the grass, their laughter carrying on the crisp morning air. Women moved about, with practiced rhythm, grinding maize with stone, carrying water from the river, stitching hides stretched taut between poles. Dogs barked as Kael's horse approached, their tails wagging, their eyes bright with welcome. But when the people saw Ella, the camp quieted. Conversations faltered. Eyes turned toward her, some filled with curiosity, some with suspicion, others sharp with something close to hostility. Her stomach twisted. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, wishing she could shrink into it, vanish into smoke. She had always known the stares of others, ever since her stepmother had paraded her in church as a burden, an inconvenience. But here the stares burned different. They measured her, weighed her. She was no longer simply unwanted. She was out of place. Kael dismounted with ease, his boots landing softly on the earth. He held the horse steady, then reached up a hand to her. For a moment, Ella hesitated. Her pride, bruised as it was, flared hot. She did not want to look helpless before these strangers. But her legs trembled when she tried to swing down on her own. With a sharp breath, she accepted his hand. His grip was firm, grounding, and for that heartbeat she did not feel like prey or property. She felt safe. He guided her into the camp. No words of explanation, no apologies. "Ella," he said simply when a woman asked who she was. Just her name, no title, no claim, no chain. The woman's brow furrowed. She said something in Comanche. Her tone edged with doubt, but Kael only shook his head and walked on. Ella's chest tightened. She wanted to ask him what they had said, wanted to demand what she was to these people. But his silence was iron, and she had already learned that questions to him yielded answers only when he chose to give them. The day stretched long. Kael disappeared into his duties, checking horses, sharpening weapons, speaking in low tones with the elders. Ella was left to sit near the fire, her hands folded uselessly in her lap, while the women worked with efficiency all around her. She watched as one pounded maize until it became soft meal. Another stirred a pot of venison stew that filled the air with a mouth-watering aroma. She caught the wide eyes of children peeking at her from behind hides, giggling when she smiled at them. Every moment she felt the divide between herself and them, between belonging and exile. By nightfall, exhaustion gnawed at her. She curled near the fire, the blanket Kael had given her wrapped tight. The flames licked upward, sparks spinning into the star-pocked sky. The sounds of camp quieted, the low murmur of voices fading, children's laughter replaced by the soft rhythm of drums somewhere, Farther away, her eyes had just begun to close when a shadow fell over her. She startled, but it was Kael. In his hands was another blanket, heavier, fur-lined. He didn't speak as he draped it over her shoulders. His scent cedar, smoke, and horse clung faintly to the fabric. For a moment, she thought he might say something, but he only gave a small nod before stepping back into the darkness. Ella lay still, her heart pounding strangely in her chest. It was such a small act, a simple kindness. And yet, it warmed more than her body. It touched some place inside her that had been cold for far too long. Her last thought before sleep took. Her was not of her stepmother, or the jeering men in the town square. It was of Kael's hand steadying hers, and of the possibility, dangerous but undeniable, that she was no longer entirely alone in the world. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last, yet strangely lighter than anything Ella had known in years. She woke before dawn, the cold desert air sharp in her lungs, and watched as the camp came alive. Smoke spiraled from fire pits, the scent of wood and cooking meat mingling with the fresh, earthy tang of the river. Children raced across the grass, barefoot and unafraid, shrieking as their laughter bounced off the lodges. Women moved with quiet precision, grinding maize, tending fires, and stitching hides. Every motion had a rhythm, a life she had long forgotten dotted first. Ella had been clumsy. Her hands, unused to work beyond dusting the family's house or pulling weeds, trembled as she tried to lift water from the river or pound corn into meal. The stones were uneven, the weight heavier than expected, and the women's eyes followed her, some with patience, others with barely concealed doubt. She faltered. She spilled water, dropped the pestle, burned herself on the cooking pot. But she kept going, cheeks flushed with shame, refusing to let the fear of judgment drive her back to idleness. Kael watched her, usually from the edge of the camp or atop a ridge where he checked horses. His presence was constant, though quiet. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in measured tones that carried the weight of authority without anger. One evening, as she struggled to lift a large hide over a frame, he appeared beside her silently. "Lower it slowly," he said, his voice calm but firm. Ella obeyed, her arms trembling under the strain, and the hide settled into place. He gave a small nod, then vanished again before she could look up. It was in these silent moments that she began to understand. The man who had bought her with silver. Kael was not loud, not boastful. His strength was in his precision, his patience, and his sense of responsibility. He did not demand respect. He earned it by the way he moved, by the way he protected, by the way he simply was. By the end of the week, Ella could carry water without spilling a drop, pound maize with steady rhythm, and even help prepare the evening meal without the women's impatient sighs. They began to smile at her small successes, offering tips, sharing small stories, and allowing her to laugh at her own mistakes. Each smile was a stitch in a tapestry of belonging she hadn't realized she craved, and yet there were moments of unease. Every time she looked at Kael, she was reminded of the precariousness of her situation. He had paid for her freedom, yes, but he was a warrior with his own battles and responsibilities. She was still an outsider, and outsiders could be discarded as quickly as they were welcomed. One afternoon, after she had helped with the children and delivered water to the lodges, she found herself sitting by the river alone, watching the sunlight ripple across the water. Her fingers toyed with a silver nugget, a small remnant of the silver Kael had offered to her stepmother. She turned it over, feeling the rough edges beneath her palm. It seemed almost sacred now, not just metal, but a symbol of a life she had reclaimed, even if she didn't fully understand how yet. The sound of footsteps startled her. Kael stood there, his shadow stretching long in the evening sun. She braced herself, unsure if she should speak. "You are learning," he said simply, eyes fixed on the water, not hers. You have strength." Ella felt heat rush to her face. Strength? She had felt weak every day for decades. Yet his words, though few, carried weight. They were not flattery, they were acknowledgement, recognition, something she had never received from her stepmother, never even dared to expect from anyone else. She nodded silently, unsure what else to say. The sun dipped lower, painting the river in gold and crimson. Kael did not linger, leaving her to the stillness of the water and the hum of insects in the grass. Ella traced the reflection of the sky on the river's surface, thinking of the path that had led her here from auction blocks to this living, breathing community, guided by a man who spoke so little but conveyed everything through action. She understood something profound. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains. It was the chance to belong, to be seen, to be acknowledged. And slowly, in the rhythm of work, in the shared laughter of children, in the quiet nods of Kael and the women, Ella felt that belonging grow. For the first time in her life, she dared to hope that the world might not be cruel, that she might survive it, and perhaps, in some small way, flourish. Freedom, Ella soon realized, was fragile. Rumors traveled faster than the wind in the desert, whispers carried along the trails, reaching ears she had never imagined would care. Word of her sale by her stepmother and of Kael's intervention spread across the towns and ranches beyond the valley. Her stepmother, furious that her scheme had been thwarted, had begun to stir the men of the surrounding area against them. An Indian thief stole her. The gossip ran, carried by merchants and cowhands. That warrior has no right. He will bring ruin upon anyone who shelters him. Ella felt a tightening in her chest as she listened to fragments of the stories when camp visitors came and spoke in hushed tones. Her stomach twisted with fear. She had finally found a semblance of peace, a place to belong, and now the shadow of violence loomed once more. Every laugh of the children, every stride of Kael across the valley, felt charged with tension she could not shake. One evening, as she helped the women prepare a simple meal of roasted venison and maize, she noticed a dust cloud rising in the distance. She froze. Kael, who had been tending the horses, stiffened as well. The children ceased their laughter, sensing the tension. Ella's heart pounded like a drum against her ribs. "They're coming," she whispered, though she wasn't certain if it was to Kael or herself. Kael's jaw tightened. He did not speak, but his hands moved with precision, checking the weapons, securing the lodges, and calling the young men to defensive positions. His presence, calm and unwavering, spread a quiet authority over the camp. No one hesitated. Ella wanted to run, to hide, to flee back to some imagined safety, but the women and children depended on the camp's strength now. She realized she would have to face what was coming. That night, she approached Kael as he stood near the river, sharpening a spear. The moonlight caught the edges of his face, highlighting the determination etched into his features. "Take me back," she said, her voice shaking. "If they come, they'll bring fire and death. I cannot be the cause of this." Kael's dark eyes met hers, unyielding. "You will not be returned to chains," he said simply. His voice, firm as the rock beds of the river, left no room for negotiation. Ella's throat constricted, and for a moment she felt both fear and awe. This man who had rescued her, had carried her to safety, now stood as her protector, ready to face whatever storm approached. The dust cloud grew larger as dawn approached, and with it the sound of horses pounding against the earth, rifles gleaming, and men shouting. Ella's stepmother led the charge, her anger apparent in the way she spurred her horse forward. "She's mine," she yelled across the wind, her voice cracking with fury and triumph. Ella gripped a nearby rock, her hands trembling. She felt fear clawing up her spine, but also the lessons she had learned in the camp: to endure, To observe, to survive. Kael moved among the camp, positioning defenders and signaling quietly to the women and young men. When the riders approached, he did not flinch. His spear flashed in the first light of morning, his movements a blend of fluid grace and lethal precision. One by one, the attackers faltered under his assault, disoriented by the sudden ferocity and coordination of a camp that had been underestimated. Ella crouched behind a boulder, clutching a child to her chest, watching Kael move like a storm incarnate. He was both shield and sword, the guardian of their fragile peace. She realized, in a rush of terror and awe, that he would never allow her to be taken, and yet every gunshot, every shout, made her stomach twist in fear. This was no longer an abstract threat. This was real, and it could end everything. Hours. Felt like days. The dust settled, smoke rose from trampled ground, and finally the riders began to retreat. Men who had come to claim Ella as property were pushed back, their bravado shattered by the skill and determination of Kael and his people. Her stepmother, humiliated and disarmed, had no choice but to flee with them, swallowed by the desert. She had once sought to control. Ella sank to the ground, her chest heaving. Tears streaked her dirt-smudged face. Kael approached, his hands stained from battle, his chest rising and falling with effort. He knelt beside her, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You are safe," he said. Not a boast, not a threat. Just a fact. For the first time in weeks, Ella believed it. The danger had passed, at least for now. And in the shadow of survival, she felt the stirrings of something new, trust, and perhaps the fragile beginnings of hope. The valley was quiet in the hours after the raid, but the calm was not peaceful, it was heavy, weighed down by the memory of violence. Smoke curled lazily from broken fires, and the scent of scorched grass and upturned earth clung to everything. Children huddled close to their mothers, eyes wide with fear, and the women moved with tense efficiency, repairing what had been damaged while speaking in low, urgent whispers. Ella wandered among them, her hands trembling, unsure where she could. "Be of help." Kael sat atop a ridge, surveying the valley with eyes that missed nothing. The young men gathered around him, their expressions sober, their weapons ready even as they tried to calm themselves. There was no celebration, no laughter only. The quiet hum of survival. Ella approached him cautiously. Each step felt heavy, as if the dust itself tried to anchor her to the ground. "Kael," she whispered, voice raw, "are we safe now?" He turned his gaze toward her. His dark eyes softened for the briefest moment, and she caught the weight of exhaustion there, the toll of protecting the camp, of facing men who had come to take what was not theirs. He did not smile, did not offer comfort in words, but the fact that he acknowledged her presence was enough. "Safe enough," he said finally, voice low, steady, like the river that ran through the valley. "They will not return today." Ella nodded, her throat tight with relief and lingering fear. She glanced around at the camper camp in some strange, tentative sense, and realized how deeply she had come to care for this place. For the first time, she felt a connection that went beyond gratitude. It was fear, yes, but also pride, belonging, and something new, a fragile sense of home. As she moved to help a woman rebuild a fire, she caught a glimpse of Kael moving among the injured, checking each child, each elder, with careful hands. His movements were fluid, precise, a blend of strength and attentiveness that left her both in awe and unsettled. He was a warrior, yes, but also something else entirely, a protector, a silent guardian who carried the weight of responsibility with unwavering resolve. That night, after the fires were relit and the children lulled to sleep with soft lullabies, Ella found herself sitting alone by the river. The water reflected the silver moon, disturbed only by the occasional leap of a fish or the ripple of a gentle breeze. Her fingers toyed with a small silver nugget she had pocketed, a fragment of the metal Kael had used to buy her from her stepmother. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the rough edges, the weight of it. It was not just metal, it was a symbol. A bridge from a life of shame and fear to one of possibility and choice. Kael approached silently, the soft crunch of sand under his boots announcing his presence. She did not flinch. Somehow she knew he would not harm her. He crouched beside her, his gaze resting on the water, not hers. For a long moment they sat in silence, the river's gentle murmur filling the space between them. "You did well today," he said finally, voice low but firm. "You helped them survive." Ella shook her head, overwhelmed. "I barely did anything. You fought for all of us. I just watched." He tilted his head, considering her words. "You survived. You stayed. That is not nothing." Her chest tightened. The truth of his statement sank in deeper than any words of praise she had ever heard. She had been bought, yes, but she had also chosen to endure, to face the storm, to stand even when fear threatened to paralyze her. And Kael had seen it, recognized it, without needing her to say a single word. The river reflected the moonlight, silver and still, and in that light, Ella felt a fragile warmth bloom in her chest. Fear was still there, it would not leave. So easily, but so was something else. Trust, respect, a tentative thread of hope. Kael finally rose, straightening to his full height, the silhouette of his long black hair and broad shoulders framed. "By moonlight, rest," he said simply. "The camp is safe for now." Ella watched him disappear into the shadows, and as the night deepened, she pressed the silver nugget to her chest. It was a reminder of the price paid, yes, but also of the life she could now choose. The fear, the danger, the uncertainty, they were not gone. But for the first time, she felt capable of facing them in the quiet of the valley. Ella realized something profound. Survival alone was no longer enough. She wanted to belong, to live. Fully, and perhaps, in some way she could not yet name, to be part of the life Kael had fought so fiercely to protect. The dawn broke slowly over the valley, painting the river in gold and crimson, but peace had not yet fully returned. Ella rose from her blanket, still damp from the river's mist, and surveyed the camp. Though the men had retreated, the memory of their aggression lingered in every whisper, in every nervous glance of the children, in the tight grip the women held on their tools and weapons. She could still see her stepmother's face in her mind, twisted with rage and humiliation, reminder of how fragile safety could be. Then she heard it, the distant thunder of hooves. Dust rose in the morning air, a sinister cloud growing larger by the second. Her stomach clenched, and instinctively she reached for Kael, but he was already moving, as if he had sensed the danger the moment it appeared. His long black hair streamed behind him, the sunlight glinting off the tribal markings etched into his arms and chest. His eyes, dark and fierce, locked on the approaching riders. "They're coming back," she whispered, almost to herself, the fear in her voice. Raw and trembling, Kael didn't answer. He simply moved. His body was a weapon as he guided the camp's defenders into position. Women and young men took their places behind logs and boulders, armed with spears, bows, and rifles, while the children were ushered behind the lodges. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was part of this defense, now not a bystander, but someone whose life and choices mattered in the unfolding battle. The attackers surged forward, led by her stepmother, her rifle raised, her face twisted with fury. "She's mine!" The woman screamed across the valley, her voice carrying over the wind. Kael stepped forward, a living wall of strength and defiance. His spear flashed in the sunlight, cutting through the first line of riders. His movements were a blur, precise. and deadly, every strike and thrust calculated. The camp fought with the cohesion of a single body, every motion echoing Kael's silent command. Dust, sweat, and the scent of blood mixed with the morning air, creating a haze that burned Ella's eyes and throat. Ella crouched behind a boulder, clutching a child to her chest, her hands shaking. She could not stop the tears, nor did she try. But she also could not look away. Kael's courage, his skill, the sheer force of his presence, it gave her a strange, fierce strength. She whispered prayers under her breath, a rhythm to steady. Her feared daughter stepmother raised the rifle again, aiming directly at Ella. Time slowed. Ella's chest tightened, breath caught in her throat. But before the shot could find its mark, Kael moved faster than thought. He leapt into the path of the bullet, his arm raised, his body a shield. The weapon discharged, the crack echoing across the valley. But Kael did not falter. With a surge of strength, he disarmed the stepmother, sending the rifle clattering to the rocks. She fell from her horse, swallowed by the dust she had tried to wield against them. The remaining riders faltered, their confidence shattered, and the camp pressed forward, driving them away. Ella stumbled toward Kael, her hands reaching for him, her chest heaving. His body was slick with sweat and blood, but he was alive, standing tall despite the wounds. She pressed her hands to his shoulder, trembling. "Kael, you saved me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He met her gaze, fierce and steady, yet softened by a hint of tenderness. "No," he said, voice low. "You saved yourself. I only made sure you had the chance." For the first time in decades, Ella felt something like peace. The valley, scarred but still standing, seemed to breathe with her. The river sparkled. In the morning light, children laughed cautiously, and the women returned to their work, proud and resolute. Kael took her hand, lifting it gently. "You belong here," he said simply. "Not because I bought you, not because anyone else decided, but because you chose to stand, to endure, to live." Ella's heart swelled. She realized that freedom was more than survival. It was being seen, being recognized, being given the chance to claim her own life. And for the first time, she believed that life could hold more than suffering. It could hold hope, and perhaps even love. As the sun rose higher, casting light over the valley, Ella pressed close to Kael. The silver nugget he had used to buy her long ago rested in her hand, no longer a symbol of chains but of choice. The wind whispered across the plains, carrying the scent of sagebrush, river water, and possibility. She leaned her head against Kael's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the sound grounding her, telling her that she was safe, that she was seen, that she had finally found a place to belong. In that moment, Ella understood the truth of the journey that had brought her here. She had been bought with silver. Yes, but she had been freed with courage, endurance, and a warrior's unwavering honor. And as the valley stretched out before them, alive and breathing under the morning sun, she knew she would never be sold, never be invisible again. She was seen, she was safe, and she was home.